Canada cracks down on Christianity in public spaces. Christian singer Sean Feucht is finding out the hard way that Canada is not a free country. Our second story is good news from Canada Supreme Court, a rare 9-0 ruling opposing pimping and the purchasing of sex and protecting vulnerable women from exploitation. American singer Sean Feucht's 11-city tour of Canada has turned into a viral journey through progressive totalitarianism. Now, Sean Feucht is an American Christian singer, and he showed up to play a bunch of small concerts across the country, and instead, it turns out, his tour provoked a moral panic from Canada's progressives. Now, part of this is funny, and part of this is sort of grimly revealing and very unfunny, because what we're witnessing is an attempted crackdown that is gaining global attention and revealing Canada to be the increasingly censorious and totalitarian country that it is, bringing up questions such as, do Christians have freedom of expression in public spaces? And the answer is, not if many journalists and politicians get their way. Before I kick off with a description of how this tour is unfolding and all of the various things that have taken place, I want to play for you a clip from Global News 7 days ago. It's titled "MAGA Movement Rising Star and Christian Rocker Sean Feucht's Halifax Show Faces Backlash," and see if the same things that jumped out at me jump out at you.
And the glory of the Lord arises on you, Canada.
Christian rocker and missionary Sean Feucht is scheduled to begin his Canadian tour here at the York Redoubt, a National Historic Site, on Wednesday night. Todd Smith and his family live across the street, saying they left the U.S. to get away from the MAGA movement after President Donald Trump was re-elected. But now, it's followed Smith right to his doorstep.
I can't explain the level of frustration and, I guess, anger that I have that we've moved all the way up here to get rid of it, and it's really, literally slapping us in the face across the street.
It's important to note here that I think he means figuratively slapped him in the face. It did not, in fact, literally slap him in the face, but based on the intelligence of his other comments, we'll forgive the mishap.
With recent sovereignty taunts from the U.S. president, many are taking issue with an advocate for Trump performing at a historic Canadian site.
What could revival look like in our day?
Feucht is a rising star in the MAGA movement, known for speaking out against abortion rights and LGBTQ2+ causes.
I kind of see Canada as a place that is opening to everybody. And what's happening across the street is not opening to everybody.
The irony of a statement like that almost figuratively slaps you in the face. He thinks that Canada should be open to everybody, except for people that disagree with him on abortion rights and LGBTQ2S causes, as Global News puts it. So who is Feucht? Feucht is an American Christian singer. He specializes in sort of praise and worship music favored by a lot of evangelicals. It's really not my cup of tea, but that's irrelevant. And in fact, Sean Feucht is not a lot of people's cup of tea. The concerts were going to be pretty small until progressives decided to make him famous by complaining, including, it looks like, one of the primary people to kick off the campaign against Feucht is literally an American who moved to Halifax and then started complaining about a fellow American, which is hilarious because this whole thing is being kind of trumpeted as a defense of Canadian progressive values against an American invader, but it's actually a disgruntled American who's not super familiar with English that is the one leading the campaign here. Now, outdoor concerts like this have been par for the course for decades right across Canada. There's lots of Christian events that host them, and they almost always take place without attention or incident. But not this time, because Feucht had all 6 of his pre-scheduled concerts in Eastern Canada abruptly canceled after an undetermined number of activists began a campaign of complaints. So in Halifax, that concert was canceled due to evolving safety and security considerations, which were cited by Parks Canada. This is a way of them canceling something without explicitly citing the content as the reason for the cancellation. And then his other concerts were canceled in swift succession in New Brunswick, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, and Ontario. Now, this is what's known as the heckler's veto. Progressive activists decide that Feucht's concerts are an issue, and then government officials decide to agree with them. And because Feucht is pro-life, and because he opposes the LGBT agenda, which I would note many Christian Canadians do as well. He has been dubbed a MAGA figure by the Canadian press as a justification for turning his concert tour into a political circus instead of what would have just been a series of, again, low-profile Christian events characterized, I would point out, by voluntary attendance. It's really interesting because although Feucht is cited as a MAGA figure by virtually every mainstream Canadian outlet that covers him, he basically is just a guy who voted for Trump, like tens of millions of other Americans did. But they cite as evidence always that he opposes abortion and that he opposes the LGBT agenda. And so Canadian Christians, I think, should really note that Feucht's pro-life and pro-family views have been explicitly cited by everyone who has successfully petitioned to get his concerts canceled, and that these grounds for canceling his concerts would also apply to Canadian Christians hosting a concert or a sing-along or any other event in a public space. The CBC actually referred to his anti-women's rights views as a justification for canceling his events. And by anti-women's rights, of course, that's a very long and clumsy way of saying pro-life or opposition to killing children in the womb. And they actually hunted through his platforms to uncover these pro-life views. As Feucht noted on X, and he's obviously right, if I had shown up with purple hair and a dress claiming to be a woman, the government wouldn't have said a word. Again, that's clearly correct. So organizers have been scrambling to find alternative venues, and this is where the story gets much, much grimmer than a bunch of cancellations. An evangelical church in Montreal hosted him at a hastily scheduled conference on the evening of July 25, last Friday. But even this private venue was targeted. Protesters gathered outside the church, a smoke bomb was set off inside, and then the city of Montreal fined the church. I'm going to mispronounce this, but excuse me. It's the Ministerios Restauration Church in Plateau, Mont-Royal. They fined them $2,500 for holding the concert without a permit. So they canceled his pre-scheduled concerts on public property due to the content of social media posts about the LGBT agenda and abortion. And then when he's hosted in a private church, the city decides to fine him for holding a concert, without a permit. But that was actually just a fig leaf justification for targeting him because of his views, because a statement from Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante stated the real reason for the fine. Quote, here's what the spokesperson Philippe Massé said to the press. This show runs counter to the values of inclusion, solidarity, and respect that are championed in Montreal. Freedom of expression is one of our fundamental values, but hateful and discriminatory speech is not acceptable in Montreal. So they said that they fined the church for hosting a concert without a permit. But when asked for the reason why they'd issued the fine, the spokesperson for the mayor of Montreal emphasizes that there is no place in the city for views like the ones expressed by Sean Feucht. Now, again, Feucht wasn't even giving speeches about abortion, which is something that I do. He wasn't even giving speeches about the LGBT agenda, which plenty of Canadian activists do and plenty of Canadian pastors do. He was there to sing a bunch of praise and worship songs and pretty anodyne stuff based on the footage that I've seen online. But merely because of the views he held, views shared by the members of the church that he performed at, he was canceled. And again, they can't get away with claiming that this was merely because the concert didn't have a permit, because when asked, a spokesperson for the mayor emphasized it was the content of views that he held that were not even expressed during the concert that were at the root of the cancellation. Now, his tour is still continuing, and as Chris Selly pointed out in the National Post, the Streisand effect is actually turning him into a much larger figure than he would have been if Feucht had been left to play his concerts in peace. I would never have even heard of him if they hadn't tried to cancel his concerts. I don't really care for that type of music. I'm not aware of what kinds of Christian concerts go on across Canada. I heard about this guy because a disgruntled American in Halifax and then a bunch of abortion activists and LGBTQ2S supporters decided to make a really big deal out of these events. So he's managed to get a few other venues. He played in Toronto and he's planning to continue across the country. I don't think that most of it, at last reading, Most of his Western venues hadn't been canceled, and now he will likely play on the grounds of the Alberta Legislature, which is public space that you can rent. This is where the Edmonton March for Life is held, and so you can hold any kind of event at the Alberta Legislature. And so Feucht is actually scheduled now to play on those grounds. Again, he's turning into a much bigger figure than he would have. Now, whether or not he is permitted to play his Christian songs on public property is turning into a litmus test for freedom of speech. And of course, this is a litmus test that Canadian progressives are failing badly. There's been a lot of libertarians online, and even just sort of generic libertarian Canadian commentators and newspapers who are expressing shock by the backlash that has been triggered by progressive Canadians against this concert tour. Now, as somebody who works in the pro-life movement, I can tell you that the dedication to free speech in Canada is so shallow that the first instinct of many Canadians when encountering views in public that they disagree with is to call the cops. I have seen this happen more times than I can count. So I'm not really surprised by this reaction, but a lot of people are surprised by this reaction. Because so Dr. Chris Wells, who's a bigoted LGBT activist and an academic recently appointed to the Senate by Justin Trudeau right before Trudeau left office, responded with fury to the revelation that Feucht was probably going to be playing the Alberta Legislature grounds. He said, "This concert," in quotation marks, as if it's not a real concert, "should not be allowed to be held at any public-owned facility, let alone the Alberta Legislature. Pull the permit like other cities have done. There should be no space for hate on any public property." Again, what Wells is doing is stating that any expression of Christian orthodoxy on sexuality or marriage constitutes hate. Any opposition to the transgender agenda, even if you're not a Christian and you just oppose, say, sex changes for minors, is, according to Chris Wells, an expression of hate. He is saying that anybody who holds views that the majority of Canadians have held for the majority of Canadian history, and most Canadians believe 10 or 15 years ago, constitute hate, and they should be barred from public. So this isn't just about Feucht. This is about Canadian Christians being banned from expressing their views on public property that is, I might point out, maintained with their tax dollars as well. It's about institutionalized bigotry, full stop. It's a de facto ban on Christians in public spaces. Now, Wells and a couple of other people have stated that the charter doesn't apply to public spaces. And it shows you how ignorant these people are. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies explicitly to public spaces and not private spaces, which is why a church has the right to refuse an LGBT activist if an LGBT activist applies to speak from their pulpit. But a public space is actually governed by neutrality, which means that you are not allowed to discriminate based on the viewpoint of the person applying to use the space. And Wells doesn't even understand the most basic facts about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this guy got appointed to the Senate. And again, you can disagree with me about whether or not Feucht's views constitute hatred or whether my own views constitute hatred, but you can't argue with me about the facts of where the charter applies. And Wells didn't even know that. It is incredibly easy to get a PhD in this country, as evidenced by the fact that he has one. And it wasn't just Wells, though. It was also members of Parliament from the governing Liberal Party. So Halifax Liberal MP Shannon Miedema said this, and try to pick out the number of insane contradictions in this statement. "I have the utmost respect for the value of free speech." So when a Liberal MP says something like that, you know a but is coming. "But I do not believe this event aligns with Parks Canada's core values of respect for people, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or integrity." So she's got DEI plus a bunch of other stuff. Now here's PEI MP Sean Casey. "While I fully respect the right to freedom of expression," spoiler alert, he doesn't, "I do not believe this event reflects the values of inclusivity and respect that define the city of Charlottetown or the government of Canada." In other words, the government finds the personally held views of a singer objectionable and therefore has the right to bar them from a space that they have already booked because the charter doesn't apply to one of the only spaces it explicitly applies, which is public spaces. And these are the people who are part of the governing party of Canada. So in short, freedom of speech, but only if I personally approve of that speech. So not freedom of speech or freedom of expression at all. An idiot can figure out that this is completely stupid and completely inaccurate. Now, Conservative MP Garnet Genuis, he characterized these quotes well. He just called it Orwellian, which is pretty much all you can say to stuff like this. Some Conservative MPs have fortunately been defending the rights of Canadians, and the pushback that they are getting for this is similarly revealing. So, Member of Parliament Michael Barrett said, "You don't have to agree with Sean Feucht to be concerned. When the CBC and government censor worship or suppress dissenting beliefs, they violate the freedoms of religion and expression guaranteed in Section 2 of the Charter. That is deeply illiberal." That is a very anodyne expression of the way the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is supposed to function, with a reference to the specific section of the Charter that protects freedom of speech and freedom of expression on public property. Again, these were pre-scheduled conferences that were retroactively canceled because an American whiner in Halifax complained, and then got a whole bunch of boomer Canadians obsessed with abortion rights and the LGBT agenda really exercised about this. And if you don't believe me, the rest of that global clip is basically just elderly people complaining that there are young people who disagree with them. So, MP Bob Zimmer actually posted a video of Feucht being interrogated by CBC journalists on whether he had a permit to play his songs in a church that invited him to play there, with a quote from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so here's the quote Zimmer posted. This is all he posted. Section 2 of our Canadian Constitution, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. A, freedom of conscience and religion. Wouldn't that be nice? B, freedom of thought, belief, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. And C, freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. So this is all he posted. The response to this quote, a quote from one of Canada's fundamental documents from Rachel Gilmore, who, if you've never heard of her, you're fortunate. She's a perpetually fired progressive journalist and sort of a specialist in faux outrage, responded to Zimmer quoting with this sort of breathless outrage. Here's what she said. "This Conservative MP is defending a Christian nationalist, and then she blasphemes. This Christian MP is defending a Christian nationalist. She's quoting Canada's fundamental documents. In other words, the Charter isn't for these people. Can you believe it?" Now, Gilmore's reaction, and indeed her complete contempt for those she disagrees with, is a good summation, by the way, of how progressive Canadians view Christians who have the gall to believe that Canada's Constitution and Charter actually apply to them as well. So they're really letting their mask slip. And the fact that a couple of anodyne, small-scale concerts being played by a Christian singer across the country have triggered this level of outrage gives you an idea of what Canada's progressive ruling class actually thinks about the rest of us. Like, Rachel Gilmore is capable of having a near cardiac event simply because somebody she disagrees with is singing some not particularly interesting songs in public to a small handful of people who show up to events like this. As Feucht himself noted on X, "I've led worship and preached in Africa, the Middle East, and all across the world in 2025. The most intense persecution was not in Iraq or Turkey, but Canada. I didn't have that on my bingo card." Well, I wish I was surprised, but all that we really saw from Sean Feucht's tour is the fact that Canada's progressives are so allergic to anybody who might hold different views than them that they react like a vampire who sees a mirror when they realize that such people exist. Because, as William F. Buckley once said, a liberal is somebody who claims to accept other people with other views and then are shocked and horrified to discover that there are people with other views. Shifting to some good news from Canada, we got a rare unanimous 9-0 ruling from Canada's Supreme Court. The Canadian Supreme Court actually upheld the country's prohibition on inducing or profiting from the sale of sex on July 24. In a very stern judicial rebuke to advocates of so-called sex work, all 9 justices affirmed, in a case referred to as R.V. Klobuchar, the prohibitions to the Criminal Code of Canada, the 2014 Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. To give you a bit of background on this legislation, it has a boring name, but it's actually really important. This act adopted the so-called Nordic model for combating the sex trade. And what it did was it criminalized the purchasing of sexual services or advertising the sale of sex or purchasing sexual services or pimping. And so what this does is it essentially shifts the criminal penalties from the selling of sex, prostitution, to purchasers and pimps. And the reason this is called the Nordic model is that this legislation is targeted towards reducing the exploitation of vulnerable women and girls. And what would happen when you merely banned prostitution is these girls or these women would be arrested and then they'd be picked up on the corner outside the jail by their pimp and they'd be trafficked all over again. Whereas if you shifted all of the criminal penalties to the pimps and the purchasers, you reduce prostitution, rescue vulnerable and exploited women, and at the same time, you're having a far more wide-reaching social effect. So this case stated that, the legislation, stated that prostitution is inherently exploitative, which is significant, due to the harm caused by, quote, the objectification of the human body and the commodification of sexual activity, which in my view could later be used to take action against the online porn industry, since the world's largest porn company is actually based out of Montreal. Here's how the Christian Legal Fellowship summed up the Nordic model. They've got a good summary here. This approach has also been adopted in Sweden, Norway, Republic of Ireland, Iceland, France, Northern Ireland, and endorsed by the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, affirmed by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, which, by the way, they're also very anti-porn, some rare good stuff from the UN there, and upheld by the European Court of Human Rights, as well as the Alberta Court of Appeal and the Ontario Court of Appeal. Now, pro-prostitution activists claim that the sex trade constitutes legitimate sex work and it's not exploitative, and they've long objected to Canada's Nordic model on those grounds. And as CLF, Christian Legal Fellowship, reported on January 24, this was a key argument they advanced in Klobuchar, which involved two men convicted under the law's provisions as parties of obtaining a material benefit from sexual services and procuring a person to offer or provide sexual services. Now, what does that legal jargon mean? Basically, it was two men. They were pimps. They served as drivers for prostitutes in Calgary. And they were arrested and found guilty by an Alberta court of benefiting financially from prostitution, as well as being parties to procuring women for prostitution. So they won at trial, but an Alberta Court of Appeal overturned their decision. They appealed, and that's how their case ended up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court giving a 9-0 ruling against these men is very significant. They rejected claims that Canada's Nordic model is unconstitutional, and instead they affirmed the constitutionality of our law, banning the sale of a person's sex acts, and even noted, quote, in situations that might not appear to involve a specific act of exploitation, which acknowledges Parliament's conclusion that commodification and thus exploitation results from the fact of profiting from the sale of another human being's sexual activity. And the court explicitly recognized the contributions of interveners that emphasize this fact in paragraph 163. And this is a great paragraph here, so I'll summarize it for you. In forceful submissions, the intervener, the Women's Equality Coalition, consisting of the Vancouver Rape Relief Society, Concertation de Lutte contre l'exploitation sexuelle, the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, formerly Exploited Voices Now Educating, London Abused Women's Centre, and Strengthened Sisterhood, rejected the appellant's promotion of prostitution as a solution to women's economic inequality. The intervener particularly rejected the cruel logic that the overrepresentation of the most marginalized women, including Indigenous women, in the prostitution industry is akin to an employment equity program rather than a reflection of profound sexism and sexualized colonialism. So these pimps basically argued that the fact that there's so many Indigenous women in sex work represents the equitable nature of the sex trade rather than the exploitation of particularly vulnerable people. and they were strongly rebuked by justices from the bench. And it's so rare that we get a good ruling from the Canadian Supreme Court, and even rarer when we get a unanimous ruling. And Canada's Nordic model genuinely protects people from human trafficking, from exploitation, and targets those who profit from the sex trade. And so it's a great piece of legislation. I would say a key part of Stephen Harper's social policy. And so the fact that it was upheld by such a wide margin is a rare piece of judicial encouragement here in Canada. And so it was the Supreme Court's first ruling on the constitutionality of the provisions of our Nordic model and affirmed lower court judgments. And it indicates that the legislation is likely to stand long term. It was also a rebuke to advocates of the sex trade and an affirmation, which is very important, of the inherent exploitative nature of the sex trade. Now, pro-prostitution activists are predictably, very outraged by this decision. 23 advocacy organizations for the sex trade have called for the overturn of Canada's Nordic model. And incidentally, Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada is a very vocal supporter of what she calls sex work. She actually worked briefly as a stripper herself. And with the Supreme Court's July 24 ruling, it appears that the advocates for the sex trade are out of options. And so, despite the depressing nature of the first story that we covered on the Bridgehead briefing, this rare win is good news for the victimized and the vulnerable. It's good news for women and girls being exploited by the sex trade, and it's good news for Canadian society at large. And we sure do need it these days. That covers our stories for the Bridgehead briefing today. One very bad news story, but one, I would say, very good news story, an objectively good news story. We hope you enjoyed this episode or were at least informed by it. Drop a comment to join the conversation. Like and share this video if you found it helpful. And as always, you can get this podcast on any of the other platforms where you get your material. Thanks again so much for listening.